Gnogiosta, Nigasa, Aswege, Degatanyo, Shelley Hill from Six Nations, Mohawk Turtle Clan.
Bonjour, JBK Nindago, Mishikantodem, Mississauga, Jibu Nishnabi and Dao, no credit, Manoa Six Nations at Donjaba, Mi Oma and Donjaba, and Dojibam Bongiatgo.
My name is Rick Hill. I'm a Tuscarora. We follow our mother's side of the family. My dad's a Mohawk from Grand River. My mother's a Tuscarora from New York.
My name's Margaret Salt, Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation.
The landmarks and monument work was basically a historical review. Reviewing the urban indigenous strategy and what's the best way to help understand historically, currently, what are our challenges, and that is to review the history of Hamilton, and then through that historical review, understanding how many colonial representation is around the city and very little of our Indigenous history. This work is not about Sir John A. specifically, but it was about all of, the colonial history of the landmarks and the fact that there has not been any, very little Indigenous history known throughout the city. And this work is about our story as Indigenous people. It's about the story of the city of Hamilton. It's about not even the city of Hamilton, but this area in what it was prior to the city.
Well, like all the land, our people are deeply connected to it because it provides sustenance. In this particular place, the rich fish resources. People come here to fish when the fish are running. Later it was important because that's where we met with the Anishinaabe people. We made a treaty called the Dish with One Spoon. The first meeting was at the far end of Lake Ontario, and the second meeting was just around the Hamilton area. And there we agreed that we're going to share the land. We're going to all be able to harvest from this great dish to get whatever food or medicine that we need, and we're not going to fight over that dish. It was probably a very ancient treaty before the colonizers showed up and kind of upset the whole thing. When we first moved to Grand River, the Haldeman track, there was a path from there to here that our men would come down and fish. And back then it would be like a little fish camp. You'd go down there and you're fishing and you're sending the fish back. You might be smoking the fish by the side of the river. To our people, Lake Ontario is a beautiful place. This shining water. It's what's within water that means a lot to us. And it holds a lot when you think about it, all of the fish, all of the water life that our people depended on. But there's also a mystery attached to the water. The Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee believe there's also these huge serpents under them. And their job is to try to upset our canoes as we go across the lake. So you have to maintain a spiritual relationship to the water, to what's under the water, what's above the water, in order for your canoe to make it across the water. And that's a whole different thing than looking at it as a natural resource. How do we turn this into energy? How do we turn this into money? But maintaining that balance in that little canoe between those great forces of the universe, I just think that's amazing what our people did.
I was reading like in the Egyptian times and like through the Bible times, and I was reading this one passage about Daniel, and he was a high person in there, and the king made a gold statue of himself, and that was their gods. And they would get the people pass laws, and they would worship them. So, and I'm thinking like, I don't think that would be a native way to get people to worship you or look, because I think the native people are very humble people.
And you could say it's kind of a hero worship. Now, we certainly have a lot of people in the past who were heroic, did a lot of great things, and we remember them through stories and that. But it's that difference between that idea of having to erect something that's a realistic rendering of who that person was. Indigenous people didn't do that because they say that person has passed away. You really shouldn't even call their name anymore. You lay them down. But once you create that face, that posture, that position up on a pedestal, you're saying they're more important than other people. And in our society, everybody's of the same importance. Everybody's of equal heights. So I think the statues came in because they were so used to being ruled by the divine right of kings and queens, of having people to tell them what to do. So when you get a chance, people put up statues to those people who told them what to do.
I look back and through my readings and stuff, the only way I can think that they really honored somebody was they would name their children after that person that they respected or looked up to, that they would name the family members under there.
In many ways, monument making, statue making, is just another way of laying a colonized footprint on the land, putting an overlay as to what's there, renaming places. It has to have a European origin, claiming it because of that renaming. So I think statues have a lot to do with that. It's almost as if they become sentinels for colonization, of progress, and from their point of view. So usually when there's a statue, I can almost guarantee you 98.9% of the time that figure did something kind of dastardly towards Indigenous people, because their goal was to conquer us. So who are they going to erect as their heroes? But the people who help facilitate that.
So when people are glorified as being the builders of Canada, you kind of have to ask yourself, what did they destroy?
Well, the statue of Augustus Jones, surveyor, the original surveyor through this area. And the words are kind of typical because it makes it seem as if somehow he got the land through the benevolence of an Indigenous person. You'd have to ask, did Joseph Brant have the authority to give land to begin with? And why has he given them that land? Why is he giving land to the very guy who divided up all of our land and eventually sold a lot of pieces off? We need to take a look at what was really going on and how him and his friends benefited from the surveys that he did, much to the detriment of the Haudenosaunee.
One of the first things that strikes me about that is that in the treaties that Mississaugas of the Credit signed, under a lot of them were under the kind of direction of Augustus Jones's son. We were left landless. We had nothing left. And so we end up getting land from Six Nations, basically 5 square mile blocks, which is approximately 6,000 acres. And the thought of the colonial government at the time was that we were going to disappear because there was only, I think, 234 roughly people left of that band, that particular group. And so we end up with this 5,000 or 6,000 acres, which a few years later we had to pay $10,000 for this to Six Nations. Essentially, we were buying back land that we gave up so that Six Nations could have that tract of land. That tract of land was surveyed by Augustus Jones. And if you look at this plaque, you'll see that Augustus Jones was given 1,200 acres from Joseph Brant. Gave him this 1,200 acres. So you have one individual getting 1,200 acres and a group of 234, roughly 6 people being left landless in the areas he surveyed.
Loyalists. Are we loyalists? The Haudenosaunee or the Mohawks loyalists? So when I see this statue of this loyalist family, you could say seeking freedom. It's all that's pretty good. I mean, it's good stuff. But you have to ask, how did they get there? What was the price that we had to pay that allowed them to come to Canada and then gobble up the land that we hold to be sacred?
If you look in history for the War of 1812 and all the ones, the Mississaugas were the front line. It was something, but I don't think they should just recognize the Six Nations people, because I think there was other First Nations that were involved in that. It wasn't just them that went to war because the First Nations people later on didn't have to sign up. They didn't have to go to war, but they did because they were fighting for their homelands. And so I think it was for all First Nations, not just for them to acknowledge one group of First Nation to do that. May children of our children say she wrought her people lasting good. That sounds like English talk.
And so when we look at our children, as mentioned by Queen Victoria, you have to ask yourself, who are our children? Is she saying only the children that are in the UK are her children? Or is she trying to say it's the children all around the places where we've been, that we've conquered, that we've taken over? And, my inclination is she's thinking about her own children, her own UK, British, or whatever you want to call it, children. I don't think she's rushing off to Africa to look after Black kids. She's certainly not rushing over here to look after our children. And, that's when I look at our children, whose children are you talking about?
To me, I think that would be the most important, Queen Victoria, because that's who the treaties were made with, the Crown, Her Majesty. Peter Jones actually had 3 audiences with the Queen, and so I think she's very important to the First Nations people because of that treaty relationship, and that the British were supposed to be looking after the Native people. Right, so I don't think that alliance. They talk about these modern treaties, but I think if we go to modern treaties, then we're losing what the actual treaty was. And so if they want to do modern, then they may leave things out, and I think they would leave things out to that connection with the British Crown. I don't think Canada can ever sever that tie with the Crown. And I don't think the Native people should ever let them, because of that treaty relationship. And I feel that if they break that, sever those ties, then I think that would be a detrimental impact on the First Nations and their treaties.
And it makes us suppress then our own value, even if we know the other side of the story. It's just like you're going by this all this time. You're just seeing this stuff all this time. It affects you. And other people who aren't affected that same way just assume that it's right. It's there. It must be. Queen Victoria, well, she must be important because there's her statue. Not asking the question of why. What could that mean? But let's just take Queen Victoria as an example. It can be a complex legacy. Every year, at Six Nations, more people gather than at any other day to celebrate Queen Victoria's birthday, called Bread and Cheese Day. It isn't like they really care about the Queen, but they care about bread and cheese, but somehow these things got put together. And we've created our own kind of myth-making around that, of why why we do this, her benevolence. She sent us some blankets, and some people believe she sent us some bread and cheese. But when you understand that it was under her reign that these residential schools came into being, and we can't forget, particularly with the Mohawk Institute, it was operated by an English company called the New England Company for all of those years, from 1828 till 1970. England had direct impact on what we're doing here. The Church of England had a direct impact on it. What British policy was affected Indian affairs policy.
And so we have this Anishinaabeg principles, the 7 grandfather teachings. You know, love, respect, truth, honesty, humility, courage, and wisdom. And when I was learning those, I always used to think to myself, isn't honesty and truth the same thing? Why do they have those together? But if you think about it, if I know the truth, but I don't tell it, I'm not being honest. So if you look at Canada's history, that's where this falls into. They knew the truth, but they didn't tell it. So they weren't being honest. And so we have a whole, well, I was going to say a whole generation. We have generations of people who were taught a history that was a lie by omission. There was no mention of residential schools. There was no mention of how the treaties came about. There was no mention that what we agreed to is not what was written down. There's no mention that the treaties followed a pattern, which was starvation, treaty, starvation, treaty.
It's not erasing history, but we're asking for a more complete examination of what that history is. And sometimes that's hard to do when the statue or the historic plaque is getting in the way of that conversation. So we can approach it a little bit differently to say, what else do we need to know about this person or this place or this building in order to have a broader understanding of what does it really mean in the long run? It meant something in its time, that's true. But now we're talking about the long run. 100 years from now, what do we want the people of Hamilton to understand about the meaning of history, the meaning of this place?
I don't think that you're erasing it. You're just telling the truth about what happened, right? So, like I said before, like the First Nations people never had a voice in a lot of the things that or policies and stuff that were made, and we still don't really. When you look at it, you know, like, we don't really have a say because we're always given things after the fact. Like to say they already made this policy, but they never came to us and asked us our input at the beginning. They wait till it's passed through as a bill or whatever. Then then we might find out about it the last minute that it's coming. But okay, I don't think you're erasing history. You're correcting history.
And so everything is about timing. You can talk to everybody, you know, until you're blue in the face, but if they're not ready to receive the information, it's not going to do any good. So, and I think that's been the case, you know, with most, you know, with the TRC, when it first came to light, people weren't ready to hear about it, and they didn't have all the other information to, you know, corroborate it, right? So now it's a completely different place, different time, and we now have that door open and that opportunity, and I've just watched that unfold. So it's been quite amazing. This couldn't have happened. This public art installation couldn't have happened otherwise.
It's beyond learning. It's about understanding and owning the true history. And what is the true history? And I think it's important for all of us to continue to research and to continue to get to know what truly happened, so that we can move, be better for our future generation. Because this landmarks and monuments work is about, past, present, and future. Because it's not only going to reset, the true history, but it's going to be a continuous learning tool for the next generations to come. And to understand that, yes, there's significant historical trauma, and that trauma still continues today. But how can we support each other, even as allies, to come together to better support this work, and to be open about it, and to understand it, and to be inclusive? And I get it. This work people will put you in a position where you feel that shame or that blame or that guilt. This is not. Everyone's going to go through their various levels of grievances when something is different or they can't understand it. But it's also an accountability, and up to us to make sure that it's our job to learn and to better understand what truly happened, and how can we create solutions moving forward.